After a tribunal that lasted 15 years and costed £150 million at least to the state, this new bill will still leave key recommendations of the Mahon Tribunal unimplemented. Serious attempts recently to rehabilitate the legacy of Bertie Ahern and indeed the wider Fianna Fáil party, and I note that Micheál Martin was a leading minister in those administrations. The real legacy of the decades of Fianna Fáil rule lies in the findings and the workings of the Mahon Tribunal and the Flood Tribunal. It's worth reminding ourselves again, as there appears to be a bout of collective amnesia in this chamber about the actual legacy of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael control of local and national democracy. Some of the findings of the Mahon Tribunal: Ray Burke, who was jailed in 2005 after pleading guilty to not paying tax on undeclared income; Bertie Ahern, who lied about the source of over £215,000 in sterling lodged in bank accounts connected to him was €160,000. Pádraig Flynn, who took £50,000 in corrupt payments from Mahon. Corrupt payments to 11 Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael councillors, who were, as Mahon declared, abusive of the democratic system, and the late Liam Lawler, who Mahon said was hopelessly compromised by payments from developers. So this proposed bill is meant to be the final piece in a jigsaw in rooting out corruption in our planning process and in rooting through the legacy of the rule of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael at local and national levels. It's also worth remembering that the consequences of that era are not simply a long list of corrupt payments to leading members of Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael from developers and builders. It's not simply about bribes to politicians to rezone or get planning permission. It is actually the legacy of these decisions on the lives of ordinary working class communities across the country. The legacy of badly planned housing estates, out-of-town shopping centres and developer-driven plans that boost their profits but leave us with chaotic urban environments, with little thought for the building of communities with decent infrastructure or access to schools, transport or sustainable homes and housing. The wider legacy of an economy and a society where the needs and profit-seeking of developers and builders ruled and local communities had little say or control in the fundamental decisions that affected their lives and environments. The consequence of that bribery and corruption are wider, I think, than the specific developments that Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael were paid politicians to have made. They are developments and buildings that got planning permission, built on floodplains or in green fields well away from transport or from any infrastructure, but a wider system that allowed pyrite in homes, ghost estates of 2-hour commute for workers travelling to and from their homes, and housing estates in urban fringes around Dublin with little or no facilities. The boom in housing prices forced people to go in those directions. When I hear that Fianna Fáil want Bertie Ahern to come back, or some radio interview where his role in the Northern Ireland peace talk is being eulogised, I can't help thinking, when will we examine the real legacy of those decades of rule and misrule? I think, for example, of Neilstown in Clondalkin, to list just one example, where the people lived and continue to live with the real legacy of those years, of the corruption around the building of the Liffey Valley Shopping Centre, of generations living with no real town centre or services or infrastructures that those communities need. So the question really is, will this bill ensure that these things cannot happen again? Will it root out corruption from the planning process, and does it actually implement Mahon's recommendation in the area of plan and development? I don't believe it will, and I don't believe it will actually implement the key findings of Mahon. Firstly, Mahon called for powers to be transferred to an independent regulator's office. This bill sets up such an office, but doesn't divest the Minister of any power. The final decision still rests with the Minister. He may have to report to the Dáil if he rejects the regulator's findings that a development, for example, is in contravention of a national strategy, etc., etc. But I personally don't believe that that's a big deal, and I don't believe that a Fianna Fáil or a Fine Gael minister would be shy about doing so if developers said we must get this development through. I can envisage an argument on a whole range of developments where a minister would tell the Dáil that it's in the national interest to allow such and such a development to go ahead. We have now a series of amendments to the Planning and Development Act where the main thrust has been to facilitate the needs and the agenda of developers and the building industry and their profit margins. Of course, it won't be presented as this. It will be presented and is being presented as a solution to the housing crisis. But the bottom line is that we do whatever developers and builders want us to do in order to boost their profit margins and to encourage them to build. So I don't see the requirement for the Minister to explain overruling an independent regulator in any specific case as any guarantee that will ensure that there be no political interference in the planning process. Mahon recommended that the board of the National Transport Authority should be appointed by an independent board and not by the Minister. And we saw not so long ago that the decision of who gets to be on the board of the NTA is less than transparent and open. And here I wish to thank the former Fine Gael Minister, Deputy Lowry, who has wide experience of working in tribunals, for enlightening us as to what are considered qualifications needed for appointments to the board of the NTA, when he lobbied the Taoiseach for a position on the board for a friend and political ally who was, to quote, easy on the eye. The NTA is a hugely powerful agency that has been engaged in an ideological war against our semi-state transport companies at the behest of government, but with the effect of undermining public transport and carving out services for effective privatisation and driving down the workers' conditions and wages in the process. We see this graphically at the moment in the bus Ahern crisis and before that with Dublin Bus. The project to tender out routes and to court private transport companies that are mostly fronts for global multinational interests is presented as being in the best interests of the travelling public, when in reality it is clear that there is a neoliberal agenda dressed up as public interest. So some scrutiny and oversight of who gets to be on the board makes this hugely important decision on bus routes and rail and tram services is essential, but it is completely absent from this bill. Lastly, of course, is the recommendation, whose omission from this bill is really the elephant in the room. Mahon's key tribunal findings, the key recommendation to deal with the past corruption of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, was a requirement that relevant political donations be identified when a planning application is being made. This is nowhere mentioned or acknowledged in the bill. It is not true, as has been claimed, that we have acted in the key part of the tribunal. We do not have sufficient transparency in political donations and planning applications. After 15 years of a tribunal sitting and nearly 5 years after its final report, it is not good enough that we ignore this key finding. I do not accept, for example, that the regulation of lobbying register that came into effect in September 2015 is sufficient or indeed what Mahon envisaged, nor is any of the other measures which we are told will make planning and local democracy more transparent. A clear and unambiguous section in this Act is needed that requires developers and builders to disclose any and all political donations to any and all elected official politicians when they are applying for planning permission, and that information should be made easily accessible to all of the general public. The professed reason offered by the Department for these recommendations to exclude such a register would be difficult to establish and verify is simply not good enough. I have no illusions that any simple measure can stop corruption in planning and development. The very definition of what we consider to be corrupt has changed over the years. The days of brown envelopes to councillors in a bar on Parnell Square may be gone, and the bar is gone. The corruption of our political process may not be so crass or obvious, but it may have morphed into a more subtle and sophisticated form. And now there seems to be no problem with officials, for example, who worked in NAMA 1 week transferring into a private equity firm or a REIT in the next week. There seems to be no problem with the Minister meeting vulture funds on a regular basis, or developers, and writing down their wish list for legislation for tax breaks and presenting them as being in the national interest. Brown envelopes are gone, but the ultimate losers in both processes are ordinary people caught in badly planned urban environment and a system that is utterly prone to a housing crisis. So we are going to seek to table significant amendments to this bill and try to implement the spirit of Mahon and the attempt of that tribunal to stop corruption of the planning process. We will try to stop the over-centralisation of powers that the bill ignores, and we will try to bring transparency to both the appointment made to powerful bodies like the NTA and to the political donations by those engaged in the planning applications. That's the least we can do after €159 million and almost 20 years. The least we can do after the corruption this tribunal unveiled at the highest level of the state, and the least we can do is to acknowledge the real legacy of Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael in the era of Bertie Ahern, Pádraig Flynn and co.